Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to today's session on Compliant Database DevOps. First, let's start with a couple of housekeeping items. All attendees are on mute during this, but we want to hear your questions. So if you do have any during the course of today, please do enter it into the question box on the little GoToWebinar widget there, and we'll tackle those at the end, assuming that we've got plenty of time. This webinar is also being recorded, and we'll make sure we follow up with a copy of the recording as well as the slides over the next couple of days. So my name is Chris Unwin. I'm the Data Privacy and Protection Specialist here at Redgate Software. And as you can see, if you want to get in touch with me, all my details are right there on the screen. Please feel free to add me on LinkedIn. I'm not afraid of making a few new friends. And as you'll also see, I do run a podcast with one of my colleagues, also called Chris, called DBAL, which you can actually get on Spotify, on iTunes, on Google Play in the US, and indeed on the Redgate hub as well. So a little bit just about Redgate before we get started. So Redgate's about 19 years old. In fact, it's our birthday this month. Happy birthday, Redgate. And we've got about 300 of us. And that's certainly blossomed from the last number I saw. Now we've got about 202,000 customers, which doesn't seem like much, but actually when you expand that number to include the people who are actually using our tools, it gets a little bit closer to about 1 million people. We're big fans of supporting the community, and as you can see, we've sponsored a number of user groups. And of course, the one big statistic there that I really like to point out is that Redgate are big fans of practicing what we preach. We go out into the world and we tell people that DevOps is a good thing, and they go, well, do you guys do DevOps? And we say, yes, absolutely. In fact, we made just under 1,200 product releases last year, which is no small feat. So on to today's agenda. Obviously, we've got a couple of key points here to tackle. What is DevOps? Now, I personally am a big fan of making a definition at the beginning so everybody knows what you're talking about. Then we'll talk about how we extend those same practices to the database. Then we'll identify where the risk comes in as part of that process. Why is the database different? Why has it not yet had DevOps adopted into that process? And then we'll expand the definition as well to include compliance as best practice whilst we're doing that development. Now, the thing you'll notice is that there is no demos today. I'm not going to be showing you any of the tools or giving you any of the fancy stuff that we here at Redgate do, but we're going to make sure we keep this as focused on some of the principles that people should be following as part of good database design and development. So, as I said, let's start off with a definition. So there are lots of people out there who will offer ideas, thoughts, definitions as to what they think DevOps is. So if we tackle that fallacy, here's a few ideas that we get presented with. Some vendors out there will say, well, obviously buying in fancy new tools to do the job for us, that's DevOps. I hate to disappoint them. Obviously, tools do make up a part of it. It is absolutely part of the story, but actually tools don't make up DevOps. So how about automation? If we throw a bunch of people with a bunch of PowerShell at the problem, does it go away? Well, again, automation makes up part of what DevOps is, but it doesn't equal DevOps. And then finally, something that we hear quite a lot is more features DevOps, is taking new stuff and putting it out into the big wide world. Is that DevOps? Well, again, it could be definitely part of it. In fact, certainly what we're aiming at is delivering innovation to our customers and making sure that our end users are happy. But actually, in and of itself, more features is not what we're shooting for. So the best definition from our standpoint, and before we look at these principles, let's make sure that we're all on the same page as to what DevOps is. Obviously, if you ask 10 different people what DevOps is, you're going to get 10 different answers, as we've seen just there. But here's the definition of DevOps from Microsoft's point of view, and hopefully that resonates with you all as well. So the key thing to take a note of here is the words people, processes, and products, those three key elements that have to be in harmony. What this means is that you can't just go out and buy some DevOps tools and say, we're a DevOps shop now. And you can't sit your devs and DBAs next to each other and say, there you go, we've removed the walls, so we're doing DevOps. It's not just something that you implement once, and that's why I'm such a big fan of a cog and why we've got this cog here, is because it's something that you have to continuously do. It's a journey that requires that continuous improvement in all three areas. Having the right people and processes is key to the success of any DevOps initiative, and then tooling comes to help us elevate that an additional step. The other important thing to note here is that we're not talking about delivery of, we're talking about delivery of value, business value. Certainly if you've seen Kendra Little's webinar recently on the Redgate Hub, you can still go and watch that. She talks about how it's important to deliver that value to our end users, regardless of who they are. We're driving business value. So it's not about driving features. The ultimate goal of any DevOps initiative should, of course, be to deliver more value to the customers and, of course, to stay ahead of competition and to be able to easily accommodate new market changes. So let's talk about DevOps for the database specifically. Hopefully by now we all understand the benefits of DevOps and why we would adopt it. But here I've highlighted a few of the important ones when it comes to talking about databases specifically. So one common trend I see from working with different organizations is that most application teams have modernized their development and delivery process and have introduced automated testing and releases. Whereas development and release processes around databases are still neglected, although we might like to think that, in fact, we're in this wonderful new world where everything is all conjoined and delivered together, the database still forms a bottleneck to the process. In many organizations, DBAs, for example, they spend the majority of their time reviewing database change scripts, and that can take anywhere from hours to even days, depending on their release frequency. And in a lot of cases, they have to rework the database scripts multiple times until they're considered as production ready. Now, sometimes this can even have a personal knock-on effect as well when it comes to those releases. Most recently at IP Expo, I took a poll of the crowd and said, you know, who here has done a release overnight? And there was an overwhelming show of hands. So bottom line is that we understand the challenges associated with modernizing development and delivery processes for the database. And we believe that the right processes and tooling can help you achieve that true DevOps process. So again, we're going to talk about those people, processes, and of course, the tooling as well. So we've already said that DevOps is a broad concept that comprises of three key areas, but it requires the right culture, the right people, and the right processes. There's a heck of a lot of automation that can also go in to help remove some of those manual, repetitive tasks that are time-consuming and error-prone. So here on the screen, we have a typical change management pipeline for code. Sort of starts from the left where we have developers making changes and then committing those into source control. So one of those prime fundamental principles to a successful DevOps pipeline. We're actually tracking those changes, understanding who is doing what and why. So we've got a nice auditable history. We've got it a bit simplified here. We've only got 2 developers, and we're not taking the complexity of branching and merging and tried to shoehorn that into the diagram. Yes, it's a bit more simplified, but the principle remains the same. And of course, once we've then committed those changes to source control, we should have a process that kicks off some kind of continuous integration. So some documentation, some unit testing, and being able to prove that what we are delivering is robust enough to make it up into further environments. We're then happy to deploy that up through the pipeline, to testing, to QA, to staging, and then of course to review that and allow it into our production environment. So again, most people are doing this for the app code, but to summarize, it's still missing that database process. So we do like good process. In fact, we like having something like this nice deployment pipeline in place because it takes away the problems in many cases and means less of this. So of course, having a conjoined DevOps team, actually having the people making the changes and the people deploying the changes be on the same platform, as it were, the same tier, obviously means that there's greater collaboration and greater understanding. And that's what we need. We need people to actually help with the process so that we're able to understand what might go wrong. And when we increase that collaboration with the right people, the right process, and of course, the right tooling in place, there's fewer fires for us to fight. So how drastically, once we include the database and try and get rid of some of this fire, how drastically does that diagram change? Well, surprisingly not so much. At Redgate, we believe that the same principles should be applied to databases without having to change much on what we're already doing for the application code. So we believe that the same techniques and steps should be taken, but of course with some slight tweaking. You'll see we've even added a little DBA figure into this same diagram. So really the only thing that has changed is the database is now under source control as well. It's also being pushed to a continuous integration process. And then we're able to release that alongside our application code to testing, to QA, to staging, and ultimately to production. And when we source control these things together, when we build them together, and when we release them together, there's less chance that we end up in a situation where one thing's further ahead than the other. And even if we have a nice shiny box ready to go to be deployed to our application, actually having the underlying supporting database change be deployed at the same time is obviously key to being able to speed up the process and deliver robust value through that pipeline. But there is still something missing from that diagram, something that indeed underpins everything that we as data professionals do. I'll give you a second to try and guess what's missing. Now, I'm sure some of you have probably spotted, but actually it's the data. How does data, something that we haven't typically had to battle against on the application side, impact our DevOps process? Well, data is an asset. In fact, it is our most precious asset. And we need to know that it's being kept safe at every turn, whether this is part of looking after our production systems or even wherever we may be using this data for some other forms of processing. Now, bear that in mind. That phrase is going to be vital to what we define moving forwards, some other forms of processing. Well, Redgate recently ran a data governance implementation survey, something that you can actually download off of the Redgate website right now and have a look at. And in this report, over 500 SQL Server professionals responded and gave us an indication of how they handle the technical and business challenges of data governance in their organizations. And that gives us some really good insight into how people handle data as part of some of the aforementioned processes we've already been through. As you can see, a lot of people do fall under that umbrella of being in regulated industry or organizations. So we have to be treating data with the correct care and attention that it deserves. In the past, I've spoken with people who believe that DevOps actually has a detrimental impact on their data governance programs, but actually that couldn't be further from the truth. Having in place those scalable, automated and repeatable processes means that we can audit each stage and bring our good friend reliability to the party. So it's certainly easier to trace what's happening to data when we know what we're developing around it in the first place. But why does regulation such as SOX or HIPAA, or to name a few that you might be familiar with? Certainly, I've been getting lots of emails into my inbox as well about them, but how about GDPR or POPI, PIPA, PIPEDA, the California Consumer Privacy Act? Stop me if you've heard this one before. I could go all day. But what does it matter in database development? Well, data breaches continue to plague companies all over the world. And moving into the new regulated world, there are steps we have to take to try and protect our end users. Not just because we fear that we may be struck down with a massive fine, like with GDPR, 4% or 20 million euros, something absolutely crazy, unheard of, but more so for our own peace of mind, and obviously for people's confidence in our companies. So you can see some key ones there. 145 million users at eBay. Most recently, obviously, we've had an airport in the UK. We had a USB stick lost. So the Information Commissioner's Office actually had to issue that airport with a fine under the Data Protection Act. So it happens all the time, and we've got to try and spot where these data breaches are coming from in the first place. So hacking is still the top tactic used. Privilege misuse, casual events together are pretty close behind, but this isn't always cracking production wide open. In fact, many times this includes making your way into a network, sniffing around for a discarded backup file that's perhaps been moved to an incorrect location or an unusual location, or even trying to get your hands on a pre-production copy, which won't share nearly the same level of watertight security that production will. In fact, most recently, obviously, there was, there's been a lot of different scandals that we can highlight, but even as simple as someone accidentally connecting a test copy of the database to the internet can lead to a leak of information. So depending on the vertical that your company resides in, it does vary where the biggest threats are. And the thing to highlight here is that on the whole, breaches can come from anywhere. So really it's up to us and this is more around the changing role of DevOps engineers and indeed DBAs as part of the DevOps engineer team, is that breaches can come from anywhere. So it's up to us as curators of the data, or data controllers, processors, whichever definition you prefer, to do our due diligence and ensure that data is protected from the start, almost by design and by default. We need to control access to data where possible. We need to minimize data processing. See, I told you earlier, that's one thing we needed to spot was data processing. And we need to minimize that to only what is relevant and necessary. Can we justify why we're using production data anywhere other than production? Does that sound familiar? It's similar across the board for most data protection legislation. So we need to actually justify our use of that data. So unsurprisingly then, it is the database that is the #1 asset put at risk when it comes to those breaches. And we need to put some steps in place to protect that main asset. So What can you do to ensure that your database development process is not only robust and automated, fluid, agile, throw in as many buzzwords as you like, but how do we also make sure that it's secure and compliant? Well, at Redgate, we would recommend you start by looking at these 4 key areas, and that will start your journey to compliant database DevOps. Now, again, this is kind of agnostic, which tooling you decide that you wanted to put in place, assuming that the people and the processes are in place as well. So it's more about the actual concepts. So we'll start with Standardize. That seems like a good place. Obviously, there is no starting place on a circle, but it seems as good as any. So if we standardize exactly how our teams are working, say, for example, we've taken on new teams, we've split our teams, we've had a company merger, we need to make sure that everyone is following the same principles when it comes to coding, when it comes to source control. If everyone's using the same method, the same process, and indeed the same tooling, then it means it's easier to trace exactly what is happening at any stage on any of these systems that we're working on. Ensuring that there is a set coding standard as well is key, because not everyone can read handwriting. Certainly my handwriting is absolutely terrible. Thank you, age of the internet. And really what we need is something that makes everyone's handwriting more legible, certainly when it comes to coding. So keeping that standardized format and keeping that standardized source control process across all the teams so that everyone's working in the same direction is vital. The next step is, of course, automation. How do we, once we've got all of these changes, once we've committed everything into our source control system, how do we then put in place automation? Well, what we need realistically is something that will take those changes, build them into a package, so document them, test them, maybe including something like the T-SQL-T unit testing framework as part of that, and then running through those unit tests when we get to the CI step. Documenting those changes, generating the relevant artifacts, and then, of course, handing those artifacts across to whichever release management tool you prefer, something like Octopus Deploy or Azure DevOps, as it's now called. Now, once we've got those steps, those potentially gated releases or one-click deployments, however we want to have those, we do then want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on every single step. So monitoring is absolutely key throughout all of these different processes. Not only do we proactively monitor for performance tuning to make sure that, say, for example, if our disks fill up, obviously we won't be able to write any new data to the database. So we need to make sure we spot issues like that. But also from a privacy standpoint, even if we're not just tuning it for appropriate performance and spotting spikes in CPU, we should be spotting things like, are we backing up to an unusual location? Are our backups actually happening at all? Have they been stalled for some time and we've not spotted it? Are we also monitoring for the availability of our own data? Most recently, the ICO came out and said that loss of data as a result of failure to patch a system is not a defensible position. Ignorance is not a defense. So realistically, we need to make sure that everything is up to date and as secure as possible as well, so that we always have access to our own data. Finally, protecting and preserving data. The underbelly of our deployment process is, of course, making sure that everyone has the appropriate environments to work on for dev, for test, QA, staging. Now, actually creating these environments is typically from a backup and a restore or some copy down of data, which is never an ideal process, purely because not only are we taking up a huge amount of space and time to do this, but also because of the sensitivity of some of the data that might reside in production. So we need to protect that data, maybe mask it, pseudonymize it, control access to it wherever necessary. And that will enable us to know exactly what we deploy to production is going to work, but at the same time, we'll make sure that we're protecting our assets. So standardize that team-based development with tooling and processes, automate those database deployments, build them, test them, check them, deploy them, monitor for performance and availability of data, then protect and preserve the data as it comes back into pre-production as well. And then the whole journey begins again. But Chris, I hear you ask, we really liked the little diagram that we had of the flow of data from development up to production, or certainly the flow of changes and deployments. If only we had some kind of equally as beautiful diagram that brought in that same monitoring and protecting side of things that we've seen just here. Well, not to worry, I have you covered. And there we are, a complete database DevOps process, also bringing in that same compliance component. So this is our preferred database DevOps process, and a similar tool chain to the one being adopted at the likes of Skyscanner, Barclays Bank, Fitness First, Yorkshire Water, Merrill Lynch. Again, stop me if you've heard this one because I could go all day. But what you'll see along the top is that traditional application deployment pipeline we looked at, starting from the left where we have developers making those changes and committing them to source control. And then the bottom line is this protective coating we have to galvanize that pipeline with. So we monitor and optimize our production systems. We then back those up, ensuring that we're encrypting them, making sure they're in a secure location. We're then provisioning potentially sanitized copies of the database into pre-production and masking any data that we don't need our developers to see, but potentially keeping it useful and retaining the demographic as well for testing purposes. And then ultimately, the cycle begins again. The devs commit to source control. We have a continuous integration build, test, document, pass that artifact across to release management, and so on. So that's pretty much where we wanted to end up today. We've had a good overview of all the different steps that we would see as part of the compliant DevOps process. But at this point, does anyone have any questions? Well, certainly it seems as though I've answered all of your questions as part of today's webinar, so that's absolutely fantastic. So what I will do before everyone leaves is just highlight one more thing, and that is the fact that Redgate will be hosting the SQL in the City Summit. Of course, it might be a bit late for New York, but if you are still interested in attending our London or Chicago events, just make sure you go to the link on the screen right now, and you'll hear from industry experts as they discuss the challenges of DevOps adoption, share their experiences to how to successfully implement database DevOps across an IT team. So ultimately, the sessions are for anyone really who works on the Microsoft data platform. So check out the website now and remember to use the code webinar, and you can actually claim a complimentary ticket to either London or Chicago. So thank you very much everyone for joining today. As I said, the webinar will be sent around as well for you to review, but equally feel free to reach out, get in touch with me if there's anything we can do here at Redgate to help out. And I hope you have a fantastic rest of the week.